I think we can probably start now. So I'm Esther Giles. I'm from Bristol Northwest Constituency Labour Party. I'm a member of the steering group of the Labour Campaign for Free Speech, and we've organised this meeting this evening in solidarity with Professor David Miller of the University of Bristol. It's really good to see you all here tonight. We've organised this meeting at pretty short notice, and I'm really grateful to our speakers and to everybody who is here this evening. So David is having his career threatened because initially a lecture on Islamophobia, and this was in the context of Islamophobia on the campus, including from pro-Israel groups, and also following some views that Professor Miller expressed at a conference on free speech about Zionism. It does seem that the rising temperature of the debate on free speech from all sides is a consequence of the fact that legitimate platforms and spaces to be heard are becoming increasingly narrow. With regard to freedom of speech, there are basically two positions. You defend it vigorously for views you hate, or you reject it and prefer Stalinist, fascist standards. It is unfortunate that it remains necessary to stress these simple truths. Specifically, for today, academic freedom means that the university as an institution needs to have the independent right to speak, argue, debate and disagree freely without any state or political intervention. So this evening, we will hear from a panel of speakers from universities in Bristol and London, from a graduate and previous employee of the University of Bristol, and from someone who has campaigned for free speech on both sides of the Atlantic. So our first speaker is Professor Harriet Bradley from the University of Bristol, and previously a Bristol City Councillor. Harriet is going to speak about the fight for free speech, the case of Palestine. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Great to see so many people. I want to start very quickly with a tribute to David as a great comrade and an excellent academic colleague. I was suspended from the Labour Party on a fake charge of anti-Semitism in 2019, and David was one of the few people who came to support me and help me. And it was partly through him that I contacted the JVL and David Binman, who eventually got my suspension lifted. So I owe a great debt to him. I should say that it was particularly unpleasant, that suspension, because at the time I was agent for Nicola Bowden-Jones in Kingswood, who is here today. And it got in the local press, and Marvin Rees, of whom I think we'll hear more later, denounced me in a press release as an anti-Semite. Okay, so I have written to the University of Bristol, to the Vice-Chancellor and other dignitaries, to protest against these attacks and to ask for support for David, partly on ground of his excellent research on Islamophobia, but also because of academics' free speech. And there are lots of other people are going to talk about that. I just want to read a short piece from my letter, which sums it up, I think. A university is a place, especially in the humanities, where young people are exposed to ideas and interpretations backed by scholarly and rational evidence in order to learn to think critically for themselves and to go beyond ideological thinking. To this end, academic freedom of speech has always been central to the university ethos, and any attempts to challenge this ethos by politicians and external interest groups must be resisted. Okay, so this issue has crystallized around the issue of Palestine, which of course has long been an issue within the university. And my union, UCU, I know there are people from that here today, has always been a stout defender of freedom for Palestine, of which I'm very proud. I finally went to the West Bank in 2019 in November in a group led by the wonderful and very sadly no longer with us, Nina Franklin of the NEU. And I urge anyone who's not been to go, because it's a transforming but gut-wrenching experience, to see the daily treks that the Palestinians in Bethlehem have to make to go to work in Jerusalem through an army checkpoint, to see the horror of bleakness of the wall, to experience the cramped conditions of the refugee camps in Ramallah, and contrast them with the sort of luxury resorts of the Israeli settlements. All these things are horrific, but the most awful thing, I think, is the treatment of children. What happens is, although in the West Bank, the protest is of a peaceful nature, sometimes there are stone throwing by youths. And when that happens, the Israeli army call on a village, pick up a child at random, they're gagged, blindfolded, tied to chairs, they're taken off to a court which is held in Hebrew, so they can't understand a word of it. They're then sent to prison, and in prison they're often coerced to become informers in order to protect the lives of their family members. So this is appalling child abuse. I want also to read very quickly a piece from IHRA, which is the United Nations body, which is tasked with humanitarian support in the occupied territories, and also with monitoring what goes on. And this is what they say in their latest bulletin. So far in 2021, the Israeli authorities have demolished, seized, or forced people to demolish at least 227 Palestinian-owned structures, including 93 given by donors, charitable donors, displacing 360 people, including some 200 children. So these are being made homeless. At the same time, they continue to smash the olive trees and to flood fields. The extensive demolition of property, say the IHRA, is against the 4th Geneva Convention and may amount to a war crime. So to conclude, if we criticise our government for facilitating the deaths of disabled people, which happens every day, we are not threatened with sacking. If we deplore the deaths of civilians in Yemen or the caging of refugee children in USA, we're not suspended from the Labour Party. But Israel is treated as a special case. We cannot deplore its government without being accused of racism. People fear to speak the truth because they fear sanction and punishment. We must support people like David, who have the courage to speak out and not be silenced. When injustice becomes legitimated, resistance is a duty. Solidarity.
Thank you very much, Harriet. So our next speaker is Professor Jonathan Rosenhead from London School of Economics. And Jonathan is going to talk about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and its use and abuse in UK universities. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, just a few words of introduction. I'm chair of the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine. I'm also chair of my local Labour Party branch. I'm an active member of Jewish Voice for Labour, and I'm currently being investigated by the Labour Party for anti-Semitism. And not, of course, in any way reduced by the fact that I happen to be Jewish, because a lot of the people who are so investigated, suspended, or expelled are in fact Jewish. We're here because David Miller has been accused of anti-Semitism. And I should just point out, because I shall refer to it later, that Ken Loach has also been subjected to an onslaught for anti-Semitism at Oxford University over the last 10 days or so, which you may or may not have heard of. I don't think it's a coincidence. A few words about anti-Semitism, which is actually not the main subject of what I'm going to talk about. Anti-Semitism has been in existence around the world now for millennia. In the UK, we had massacres of Jewish people in the 13th century and lots of scattered violence in addition. The first racist immigration law in this country, the Aliens Act of 1905, was directed at stopping Jews from getting in. In the 1930s, anti-Semitism was endemic, not just among the fascists, but everywhere from the working class right up to the Cliveden set, was shot through and through with anti-Semitism. There were anti-Semitic riots in my lifetime in my home city of Liverpool. So this is not something historical, and Britain is by no means immune to anti-Semitism. But David's case has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has to do with the so-called IHRA definition, so-called definition of anti-Semitism, whose mission appears to be to muddy the water about what was previously a clear understanding of anti-Semitism, so it would cover other things besides. And we can trace that back to the Reut Institute report, that's in Israel, about what could be done about the growing movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And they came up with the wheeze that the answer was not to try and answer the arguments about Israel, but to try to delegitimize the delegitimators. That is, say, the people who are making these accusations against Israel are doing so not because Israel is wrong, but because they are anti-Semites. The objective of this, quite clearly, and it was taken up by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in about 2015, was to silence the voice of Palestinians and to block the rapid advance of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The international promotion of the IHRA definition followed from this refocusing of the Israeli narrative. I'm going to assume that everybody here knows roughly what the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is, and if not, then you've not been paying attention. It's been headline news for the last 5 years at least. Just in outline, it consists of 38 very vague words followed by 11 examples. The very vague words are almost, one would say, deliberately lacking in precision. They describe anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, and they don't bother to say what that certain perception is. So it can only be handled by examples, and the exemplification is in 11 typical statements which might be regarded as anti-Semitic, 7 of which are focused on Israel. And I say might be seen as anti-Semitic, but everybody quotes it as if all those 11 say any statement that matches roughly onto any of those 11 is anti-Semitic. But of course, it is a conflation of things one might say against Israel with things one might say against Jews. Saying those things against Jews as a class would be anti-Semitic. Saying those things about Israel might be motivated by anti-Semitism, but equally well could just be because of what Israel does. It enabled and enables anti-Zionism to be smeared as anti-Semitism. It's an attempt to rob us of the words to describe what's going on, to make certain kinds of things unsayable. This is, of course, particularly pernicious on campus, where the free flow of ideas is a crucial element of what we do. And Gavin Williamson, our unspeakable Secretary of State for Education, in October, tried to bully every university in England. He luckily doesn't have control over the other 3 countries, into adopting the IHRA definition as part of their framework and to implement it in terms of driving anti-Semitism off campus. That is almost certainly in excess of his powers, but it doesn't mean that he hasn't bullied and threatened the universities. The universities, I'm glad to say, are showing some signs of resistance. But even prior to that move by Williamson, there were uses of the IHRA definition against university staff. Rebecca Gould, who taught at Bristol, was one of the very first targets. The typical pattern is students, usually Jewish students, on campus make a protest about something that somebody has said in a university or published in an article. In Rebecca's case, it was mostly about an article she'd published in an academic journal. And then outside organizations pile in, typically the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism and the Community Security Trust. This is still going on. Currently, there's at least one other university where there is a complaint against 4 members of staff. This is a complaint by one person, an ex-student of that university, who has targeted 4 people, not all of whom know each other, none of whom are in the same department, but all of whom are accused by one person of anti-Semitism. This is a campaign. And of course, the IHRA definition is cited in every case. I've now managed to lose my next bit. Here we go. The decision by the University College London Academic Board is the bright light that's entered into this dismal landscape. As of February the 10th, there was an overwhelming vote against any use of the of the IHRA definition on campus, and I'm sure that Saladin will be telling us about that. This has thrown those who are promoting the IHRA definition into uproar. They are fighting with each other. They're scrabbling around to see what they can do about it. I think we should see the attack on David and the parallel attack on Ken Loach as the fight back, trying to regain some of the ground that University College London has lost them. And we must make sure they do not succeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. Our next speaker, if I can find him, is Dr. Saladin Meckled-Garcia. Saladin is a lecturer in human rights and also the Vice-President of UCL UCU that Jonathan's just referred to. And Saladin is going to tell us something about the IHRA and academic freedom, and specifically what happened at UCL UCU and why. Thank you very much, Saladin.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Before I go into what's happened at UCL in particular and what its significance is, I just want to read you a quote. It says, "Lessons should be learned from this sorry saga. We greatly regret that the case was ever brought. At heart, it represents an impermissible attempt to achieve a political end by litigious means. It would be very unfortunate if an exercise of this sort were ever repeated." Now, for those of you who recognize that, it's directly taken from Ronnie Fraser versus the UCU, a case that made it to the High Court in the United Kingdom. This is the High Court finding. The case tried to make an argument that Zionism, that is support for Israel of a certain kind, constituted a protected characteristic under UK law, such that any form of criticism or critical environment in which it was debated or Israel was severely criticized constituted a form of harassment, discriminatory and potentially racist harassment. That is, there was an attempt in this court case to align being Jewish with being a Zionist, and therefore attacking Zionism or criticizing Israel in terms of facts as an attack on Jewishness. The case, as you heard here, completely lost. It was, the judge has even worse words than the ones I read out for those who brought the case, including one, Anthony Julius, who is at UCL and has been pushing for the UCL to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. They lost, these people who have this view, lost trying to discipline and silence the UCU in debates on Palestine, in debates on BDS, and in various other discussions that took place regarding Israel-Palestine relations. But because they lost at that level, they lost legally outside, they want to have another go. And the way that they're proposing to do this is by the introduction of the IHRA definition. In that court case, the precursor to the IHRA definition, almost word for word, was used as evidence of this protected characteristic and as evidence of this apparent anti-Semitism of the UCU, because it allowed these debates to take place. So you can see what the intention is, right? It started there and it's now moved to try and introduce the IHRA by other means on campuses. So it's important to bear this background in mind. They have seen, the people who are in favor of using this in this political way, that it has worked in the Labour Party in order to silence voices inside the Labour Party. And so now they want to go back to the campuses and use it there. And this is where cases like the David Miller case, and I want to mention another case, which is the case of Goldie Osuri, who is at Warwick University. And it's not the only one. I've pasted in the chat, I've pasted a link from Independent Jewish Voices from Canada, who have been keeping track of all the incidences of how this tool has been used for political means. But what they're trying to do is to use these cases to shame universities, right? To force universities to adopt the definition or where they have adopted it, to use it in an exemplary way on particular individuals, because, for obvious reasons, because that is one way to try and chill speech on Israel-Palestine on campuses, to chill criticism of Israel in particular. Because if you see that colleagues in a university that's adopted the definition are being persecuted because they have entered into criticism of Israel, then you will think twice about using that in your teaching, in your research, or in your debates in your university, if your university has adopted it or is about to adopt it. That's clearly the end game. That's what they're aiming for. At UCL, we saw this coming a long way off. There was a maneuver by our institution to try and get it passed behind the backs of our academic assembly, which is basically the whole professoriate plus a number of elected non-professors on this assembly. It's a huge organization. It's 1,000 and something members of this assembly. And there is a constitutional requirement at UCL that any kind of changes that affect academic freedom potentially should be passed and advice sought from this body. And that's what allowed us to scrutinize it. Members of the of what we should describe as leading Jewish intellectuals on campus were incredibly upset by the introduction of this definition behind our backs by council. And this led to a fight back in which a report was written, took a year to write, showing that there is a problem. We're now awaiting the response of our council to the vote at this academic board, which was overwhelmingly in favor of repealing this definition and at most replacing it by something that was academic freedom friendly, i.e. something that is not politically loaded to try and curtail speech on Israel-Palestine. I think, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, that's the background, that's where we are. I think it's really important to get behind campaigns for people like David Miller and Goldie precisely for that reason, right? For the reason that these are being used as emblematic campaigns to chill speech, to silence, and also to show that organizations external to the university system that have a political aim in advancing this definition can exert power within the university system in the way that they seem to be exerting power within the Labour Party by having the Labour Party leadership succumb to all their demands. And that's the strongest reason to oppose it. Academic freedom exists for a reason. It is not exactly the same as free speech. It requires free speech of a certain kind, but it's not the same. Academic freedom is the right to research and to teach according to your best lights as an academic researcher, so long as you don't breach the law and so long as you don't enter into abusive or discriminatory actions. If we lose that right, then we lose the right in this country for academics, as liberal or as right-wing or as left-wing as they might be, but we lose the right for academics to, by their own lights, bring evidence to bear on questions like the question of what is happening to Palestinians in the occupied territories. And by losing that, we lose almost everything. So I would strongly, strongly support David Miller's cause as well as Goldie Osuri's.
Thank you very much, Saladin. So now we're going to move on, and actually very relevant to what you've just been talking about, Saladin. Tom Loeffler, our own Tom from Bristol, who is a graduate of the University of Bristol and also used to work for the university, is going to talk to us about free speech and limits to academic freedom.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. I'll just give you a very high-level overview of the principles behind all this. Freedom of speech is a universal right. It's acknowledged as such in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and in countless documents ever since. But the right is not an absolute right. It's qualified by law, is qualified by the need to respect the rights of others, and often also by a wish, right or wrong, to prevent offense. And that's where it gets a bit tricky. Now, the oldest test of whether something was allowable or not goes right back to John Stuart Mill, who said that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And that's the harm criterion, which has been used virtually all the time. But in more recent years, a new criterion has emerged, which is the offense criterion. In other words, you replace harm by offense. And that is a lot trickier because offense is in the mind of the beholder, whereas harm can be judged objectively. So it is getting more tricky. I'll just give you another quote. It's from George Orwell. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And I think this is where our problems with Zionism come in. I think on the whole, Saladin has covered the academic freedom issue quite well with his example. I'll just add that, again, it's a universally acknowledged right, but it's not an absolute right because you have to operate within the law of the country you're in. As far as I would say that one of the things that I found in preparing for this very brief talk is that there's actually a fairly good guidance document from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which shows that sometimes they can actually get it right, unlike the Labour Party case. And it starts by saying everyone has the right to free speech within the law. And I think that's very good. And further on, it actually has the statement, freedom of expression should not be abused for the purpose of unchallenged hatred or bigotry. And I think that's when we get into no platforming. I'll just finish off by a quote from my own letter to Vice-Chancellor Brady at Bristol. I finished my letter. I pointed out who I am and why I'm objecting to the university's even entertaining the attacks on David Miller. I'm pointing out that David Miller is being attacked because, in fact, he's a very effective researcher. In other words, he's very good at his job. But I finish with a statement to Professor Brady. I would welcome your assurance that the University of Bristol will continue to defend freedom of speech and to oppose censorship in a way that academic institutions in Germany, to their eternal shame, failed to do in the period from 1933 onwards. I haven't had a reply to this yet, but I only sent it about a week ago. I think the situation is very clear. The pro-Zionist lobby just wants to shut us all up, and we mustn't let that happen. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. We're now moving on to our final speaker before we have questions. Anita Bennett, who's been a free speech campaigner in the University of California as part of the Battle of Barclays, and also in UCL. And Anita's going to talk to us about no platforming free speech, her reflections on 4 decades of activism, with specific relevance to the current issues around free speech. Thank you, Anita.
Thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to be here and to hear you speak as well, Nicola. I have also come under attack from Marvin Rees for my work around saving the M32 maples trees. He's attacked me for being a middle-class white American woman, etc. Because some people can't argue politics, they have to argue sociology. So I want to send greetings. I am now the new chair of the Ashley Ward, where Thangam Debonair, our MP, is a member. She draped herself in the flag of Gaza in order to get one of the reasons she got elected, and she's now the whipping girl for Keir Starmer. And I speak as an American. I'm very proud of our revolutionary tradition of the first colonial revolution against the British Crown. I'm dismayed to see that it's the worst aspects of American capitalism and racism that's now invading my adopted country. I came here 48 years ago. When I left Brooklyn College, actually, I started out in California, then transferred to Brooklyn College, and then moved to UCL. That revolution was followed by the French Revolution and many other revolutions around the world. Sadly, the UK is still, like Israel, a church state. There is no separation of church and state, and there certainly is no free speech. I became a young socialist in Berkeley, California. I was drawn by the free speech movement there, the Battle of Berkeley, because the university was suppressing teaching and learning about the tragic war in Vietnam. Students fought for the right to be taught by professors. Many of those professors were Jewish and also communist. They were emerging from the trauma of the post-war witch hunt. When I transferred to Brooklyn College, I was shocked at the contrast with liberal California. All of my comrades were Jewish there, what we used to call red diaper babies, the children of Jewish and anti-Zionist Communist Party members. At Brooklyn, we had the Jewish Defense League, a very big one, an openly terrorist organization built up by the infamous Meir Kahane. We would put up our literature tables with pamphlets about the case for a democratic secular Palestine. I was always challenging a particularly obnoxious racist JDL extremist because basically they were white, working class, and very racist against Blacks and Puerto Ricans. That is the roots of a lot of Zionism as we see it. It's not in Europe. A lot of it happened in America. So I'd say, why don't you debate this? I would say to Richie, why are you afraid to debate? And why are you always tipping our tables over? Why do you call my Jewish comrades self-haters? They're Democrats. But off went Richie and his gang to upstate New York, where they boasted of being trained in guerrilla warfare to go over to Israel to claim their right of return to Palestine. He and his pals were outraged when I told them a home truth, that it was the American Zionists who actually put the pressure on the US government to prevent the Jewish refugees coming into the USA. People who read about Anne Frank might have also seen that recently. Anyway, I'd been organizing demonstrations in New York against the war. John and Yoko were being expelled, supposedly for marijuana, but really because they were against the war in Vietnam. My flat was raided by the FBI. My English boyfriend was told to leave the country, so we had 3 weeks to pack and we came over here. It was a relief to come to England, to UCL. I cannot describe the relief at being able to be openly socialist, but without being afraid of losing my job, my apartment, my family. My father wouldn't talk to me for a long time. You have no idea what it was like. Suddenly you had open debate, miners' strike. In America, everyone was conscious of Jewish groups. I didn't even know who was Jewish here and didn't even know David Miliband was Jewish, to be quite honest. So anti-Semitism I usually see as something like with racism. So to see it tied up with a state where Richie then appeared on television must have been about 15 years later. Richie, little thuggy Richie, he was an Israeli army colonel right there in Israel. So right of return for whom? But the one thing that did great on me that I just wanted to say today, which is particularly important, is that I was really shocked at what I saw as this no platform for fascists. I couldn't understand it. It grated on me because we were raised on the idea of free speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. Yes, there was a small national front and many of the students got a big kick and they wanted to organize big demonstrations, but I couldn't understand it. And later, this is to bring it right now to the present day, about 3 years ago in my Ashley ward, which is the country's biggest CLP, I was shocked to discover that the people were being suspended for having offended somebody else. I couldn't believe that. I don't know, I guess I could only call them sissies. Why can't you just have a debate, listen to it? It's not, nobody's hitting you, nobody's torturing you. Around the defense of David, which is why we've created the David Miller Defense Committee, I found myself in arguments with Bristol Uni students who clearly do not agree with free speech. They feel offended. They can get offended. And I think that this is something that we really want to try to address because really this is about the right to be able to offend and to be able to be heard. And I certainly hope that this is just the beginning of the David Miller Defense Committee and that we can really open up the question of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and an end to church states, both the British and the Israeli.
Thank you, Anita. So we do have some time now for some questions, and I can see that there are some questions already. I've seen question, when I say question, I mean question or statements from Moshé Machover, Steve Burgess, Ron Mendel, you've posted as well. Are there any other people who wish to comment or question? Yes, there's quite a few. I've got Harriet, Labina, Stephen, so that's 4. So if you can, you can have 2 to 3 minutes, Moshé. I'll let you have 3 minutes, and you can give us your comments now, please. Thank you. I'm mute.
Thank you. 3 minutes will be adequate. I have 3 very brief remarks. First of all, as a Bristolian, as a colleague, I taught at the University of Bristol 2 years in the mid-1960s in the Department of Mathematics. So in a sense, David Miller is my colleague, much younger, to whom I extend full solidarity. Secondly, I would like to make a remark as an Israeli academic, and I would like to draw your attention to the excellent letter that we, a large group of Israeli academics teaching in Britain, have written to the authorities of the all universities in England to resist the blackmail of the Minister of so-called Education, who tried to blackmail them to adopt the IHRA definition. And I also would like to draw your attention, and this is online, and I've put the URL of this letter on the chat. I've also put on the chat an excellent, much shorter letter, or an opinion article actually written by the lead signatory of the larger letter, or the longer letter, Professor Hagit Borer, an Israeli academic, distinguished linguist at the University of London, Queen Mary's, who wrote this article in the Times Higher Education. You can find also this excellent letter arguing against the adoption of this definition. And finally, I'd like to make a remark as a logician, which is my academic profession. There is a logical principle known as reductio ad absurdum, briefly known as the reductio. If a statement has absurd, overtly absurd consequences, this refutes that statement. A statement is refuted, it has absurd consequences. Now, it is obviously absurd to accuse all of those of us, many of us Jews, including myself, including David, including Jonathan Rosenhead, of anti-Semitism. I've been once expelled and reinstated, but now suspended again from the Labour Party with insinuations of anti-Semitism based on this so-called definition. Well, this refutes the definition. It means it has such absurd consequences that it must be false and therefore must be rejected. Thank you very much.
Yeah, really good point. So thank you very much. Shall we now go to Harriet? Harriet, you have 2 minutes to comment. Is that okay?
Hi, I just wanted to say something to the question that I was asked. Or we were all asked, I think, about whether it was unwise of David to talk about the JSOCs. And it gets back to this thing that Anita was talking about, which is that being offended by something that is said is now seen as discrimination, racism, etc. And it just, I always remember, you know, when I was a kid, that little saying we had, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but naughty words can't hurt you." But we seem to have a generation of students who are obsessed by naughty words. But what I wanted to read to you as a reply to those questions is what I got from my letter from, I didn't get a letter from Hugh Brady, but I got one from Judith Squires, who I know very well, because I was a faculty dean when she was in my faculty. And I just want to read you what she said, which is quite hopeful, I think. "Universities are places of research and learning where debate and dissent are not only permitted, but expected, and where controversial and even offensive ideas may be put forward, listened to, and challenged. Intellectual freedom is fundamental to our mission and values. So that's quite a strong statement and sort of tackles that offended issue. I have to say that the letter also shows the complexities of things, because she also talks about the firm commitment to making university a safe place for students. So that, you know, Tom has raised that issue quite rightly. It is a complex issue. The other point I would like to make is that I believe these comments by David were not made within the university. So it's clear that these students weren't actually having to listen to these statements. They were made at a meeting, at an external meeting. So, you know, I probably wouldn't, if it had been me, I probably wouldn't have said that, but courage to him for having said it, and it's important. Yeah, thank you.
Can I just respond on that, Harriet? Thank you. David was criticised initially, or complained about initially, because of a lecture he gave on Islamophobia. So you're correct in that his comments on Zionism in Israel were at an external event. So thank you, Harriet. Next we have Stephen Burgess. We can't see you though, Stephen. Oh yes, we can see you now. Thank you. You have 2 minutes to make your remarks.
Hi. Okay. So, can I be heard?
Yes, you can. Yes.
Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that most people are asleep on this issue. Most people believe what they're told about the IHRA definition without ever reading it, and that extends to the less leadership candidate Rebecca Long-Bailey. Rebecca Long-Bailey was tricked not once but twice by Peston into accusing other people of, specifically Jeremy Corbyn, of actual anti-Semitism. So that's based on interpretations of the IHRA definition. She said, "I believe that by the IHRA definition, that will be anti-Semitism." Now, I want to highlight what Moshé Machover said. If something has ridiculous consequences, then it must be wrong. And the fact about this IHRA definition is that so many people don't know what it says that they'd be surprised if they actually knew what it said. So, for example, people routinely say that calling for aiding, justifying, or killing the harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology or an extremist view of religion is an example of anti-Semitism in the IHRA definition. It isn't. It isn't an example of anti-Semitism. It's the first listed thing, but it's not. But those aren't examples of anti-Semitism because the preamble to the example says, could, taking into account the overall context, include, and then it gives the examples. So it's saying these could be examples of anti-Semitism. In fact, if you look at the entire list of the so-called definition of anti-Semitism, I say so-called because Moshé was bright enough to say so-called, whereas Jonathan Rosenhead, for example, wasn't, among other people. If you take that definition, so-called definition, there is nothing specified as unambiguously anti-Semitic in there. Now, I want to take this a step further because I want to highlight just how ridiculous this scam is. That Hitler, under the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, is not unambiguously anti-Semitic. The absolute icon of anti-Semitism, the classic anti-Semite, Hitler, would not be anti-Semitic if you actually listed all of the criteria that he had to meet. Because, in fact, there are no criteria listed in any of the IHRA definition. Now, so there are, in fact, no consequences to the IHRA definition, because so-called IHRA definition, because the IHRA definition, so-called definition, does not specify anything whatsoever, including Hitler, as anti-Semitic, and that is how ridiculous it is. That is why we should be going on the offensive over this and highlighting anyone, anywhere, who's highlighted the IHRA so-called definition as a valid piece of evidence or a valid document as ridiculous and a fake anti-racist. If you're not really ready to call people fake anti-racist to their face, even well-meaning, sincere people, if you're not willing to do that, then you're not really fighting for clarity and you're not really fighting against racism, because you're allowing vague, woolly, stupid, unreasonable concepts to engage your thinking.
Thank you, Stephen.
And this happened with Rebecca.
Yeah, are you winding up? Yeah, thank you. Okay. No, that absolutely made sense. We do have we do have 3 now people, but we're running out of time. So I did want to have to provide time for final remarks from the panel. Would people be happy for us to just continue a little bit over time? Yeah, okay, well, we'll carry on then, and we'll take Labina's question next. Your comment or question, Labina? Thank you.
So I just wanted to ask what we can do, because we're in so many groups, we're organized, but we're not organized as a mass to try and counter what's happening to people like Professor Miller. I'm in Labour Muslim Network, for example. I'm an associate member of JVL. I'm in my CLP, and I find some of the themes quite alarming. The link between people talking about Islamophobia and then being accused of anti-Semitism, for example, is quite alarming. Labour Muslim Network have done some research recently, and they are talking to the Labour leadership about the fact that over 30% of Labour members have been attacked, have had Islamophobic attacks from within the party. And they're basically asking the Labour leadership to look into this and meet their demands within a 6-month time frame. There's, the lady from the council, the councillor, we were attacked when we went to Haringey Council with free speech on Israel, because they wouldn't listen to the socialist Jews that we were supporting there. And our names then ended up in the paper, and we were slandered and told that we had spat at one of the councillors when this was not the case. So, I mean, I just want to know how we can organize. I'm an alumnus of 2 London universities. Should we be writing to the universities? Is there a template letter that we can send? Maybe the one that Tom has sent, maybe he could share that. I just want to hear from the panel on how they think we can organise.
Yeah, okay. We definitely need to draw it together in that way at the end if we can, next steps and how we can take effective and coordinated action. Thank you, Labina. And just two more hands up then. Tony and Anita. Tony, can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a very good meeting indeed. I agree with the speaker who said that really the only reason for inhibiting or restricting free speech is under the harm principle. In other words, if you're advocating harm to somebody else. What has particularly concerned me and is noticeable is that so-called Jewish students, who are really Zionist students, at Oxford, for example, when Ken Loach was invited to speak, said they were unsafe. And I think this principle has also been used against David Miller, that he makes them unsafe. I find this unbelievable. Are they such snowflakes that someone exercising their right to free speech, that an 84-year-old film director who's being interviewed by the master of the college genuinely makes someone unsafe? It's absolutely ridiculous. Being unsafe means you're the parent of a Palestinian child who's just been arrested by the Israeli military, and you're wondering if you'll ever see them again. You're unsafe if your child wanders into the street when there's shooting in Israel. You feel unsafe if you yourself go out and you're subject to arrest, arbitrary arrest, and so on. I think we really have to deal with this nonsense about people feeling unsafe because other people say what you don't want them to say. If you're offended, that's one thing. To say that you're feeling unsafe is just grossly dishonest, and this needs to be confronted directly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you. And finally, before we go to our panel, Anita, thank you. Do you want to unmute yourself? Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
The very last part of what I wanted to say is very relevant, Tony, to what you just said, and that is having your feelings hurt and feeling unsafe. I'd like to address that, but first of all, to Labina, I think one thing we could do most specifically is we could stop using labels. I don't like the label fascist. I don't think it helps anywhere. I think you need to talk about concrete actions, concrete policies, and not labels. That's one of the problems that Nicola has faced and many other women councillors here in Bristol. Any women who put their head above the parapet, it's very difficult. So no more labels, talk politics, not labels, not sociology. Secondly, I think what we need, what we could benefit from, what David, because that's why we're here, what David can benefit from is widening the campaign. I did actually call the Catholic chaplain at the university who was very interested in coming, but he's just in the middle of moving house, and there's a couple of other theologians, and I think we need to widen it so it's not just people that we agree with, but people who just agree on the right of David to keep his job. Very simple. They don't have to agree with all of our definitions or me or you or anybody else. It's about action. It's in uniting in action to take really decisive steps. And lastly, which is what I hadn't mentioned, some of you may know that I was the companion, the partner of the late Christopher Hitchens during the 1970s. And so during those days, you know, we went to Northern Ireland, we traveled around and we talked a lot about free speech and all kinds of things. I was dumped most unceremoniously for Anna Wintour. And one of my best friends said something which I've tried to share with the students here at Bristol University. And she said, you know, Anita, you really should remember the words of Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, I don't know if any of you know who she is. She was a wife of FDR. And she was publicly humiliated all the time because he was having affairs, right, left, and center. But she held her head up high. She didn't collapse. She didn't crush down because she was offended. What she said is very, very profound in this age of what I would call psychobabble politics. She said, and it's this, and I'll write it down. She said, nobody can make me feel bad without my permission. You know, just think about it. It's actually quite profound. You know, it's like the same thing we used to shout in the playground, sticks and stones will break my bones and words will never hurt me. You know, I think it's that basic. When you say snowflakes, just tackle it, because otherwise we never get over these wounds. We don't get over them and we don't grow up.
Thank you very much, Anita. So now if I can just ask for final comments from our panel members. So Harriet, do you have some final feedback and responses to the issues and questions that you've heard? Can you unmute yourself, Harriet? Thank you.
The first thing I'd like to say is how important the issues raised by Sabina were. The great thing about David Miller's research is his incredible work on Islamophobia. And as far as I'm concerned, Islamophobia is the main form of racism in Britain today. It's incredibly prevalent and nobody seems to give a damn about it, to be honest. And I think that's terrible. And we really need to support our Muslim colleagues within the Labour Party in whatever way we can. I do think that this has been a great meeting, and I would really like to see some action from it. And I know that that David has been setting up various groups to a group within the university and within other universities to support him. But I would really like to see us, perhaps, all the people who've contributed to this, putting in some kind of statement to the university. I don't feel this is a lost cause. I think we can win this one. But the wider issue about what's going on in the Labour Party and the Tory collusion in this by appointing the disgusting John Mann to go round and talk to the universities is something that is a bigger issue, and I don't know how we deal with that. But I think it is quite important for us to make our own protest and make it clear to the University of Bristol that they should defend a very important researcher who's done great work against, which I would call them snowflakes, to be honest. And I go back to the sticks and stones and the naughty words. We've got to fight this culture of I'm offended, I don't like what you say, and say we have to go back to a grown-up society in which people are allowed to debate and discuss everything, particularly the difficult issues like the ones about Palestine. I won't mention any other because there are many. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you, Harriet. Actually, somebody just told me that Mike Levine wanted to speak. Shall we go to Jonathan next, and then Mike? Do you still want to speak? Yeah. So then we'll go just over to Michael for a couple of minutes. Jonathan, will you unmute?
Okay. Yes, there's been a process of escalation in what counts as anti-Semitism. For example, it used to just, not only just, but it used to be the case that Holocaust denial was regarded as anti-Semitic, and in almost all circumstances it would be. Now anti-Semitism denial is seen as anti-Semitic. If you actually dispute the numbers of people or the proportion of people, for example, in the Labour Party are anti-Semitic, that itself is anti-Semitic. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nobody can say it isn't, because if so, they're liable to be expelled. But it's gone on from that, so that if somebody says they are offended by what you said, that may be enough reason to get you suspended. For example, somebody I know was chairing a meeting of her local CLP and allowed a discussion to go on, and somebody walked out and then tweeted that he had been offended, and she was suspended from the Labour Party because somebody had been offended by something which was potentially or allegedly anti-Semitic. Now, we have to stop this process. It is nonsense. And that's the reason why we need to defend David Miller. Not because we need to agree with what he said. In fact, particularly if we do not agree with what he said, because we should defend him on the basis of defending free speech. And also because if his job is lost, then we are all academics are under threat. And the resulting chilling effect will mean that many more people will be affected than those who are actually dismissed or threatened with disciplinary action. And the result will be devastating. So support David Miller.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you. So can we find Mike Levine? Did you want to say something, Mike?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say something relevant to this. When you conflate Zionism and Judaism, what you're doing is saying that all Jews support what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, that is, shooting children at the fence, etc. Now, to say that is an anti-Semitic statement because it's calculated to raise prejudice against Jews in general. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. So now, are you still there, Saladin? Yes, you are. Did you want to provide some closing remarks, please? Unmute.
Yes, I was trying to unmute myself and not having much luck. Yes, just a couple of points. Some people in the chat have raised the question of whether David Miller's statements about student organizations are advisable or wise. One thing to note is that if the statements amount to saying that the Union of Jewish Students, for example, is a Zionist organization, which effectively I think is what he said. I just think he used words that weren't as clear as he could have been on that matter. I think the evidence is incontrovertible because they themselves define themselves that way. Their constitution, Articles 211 and 215, have explicitly built in the inspiring of Jewish students to make an enduring commitment to their Jewish identity, Israel, and the community, and the representation and engagement with Israel. They are collaborating on programs of Israel engagement, as they call them, with organizations like BICOM, the British Israel Communications and Research Center, which is tasked with providing research and analysis that paints Israel in a positive light, with We Believe in Israel, does a similar thing, with the Zionist Federation of the United Kingdom, with Stand With Us UK, which is an Israel educational charity, with other organizations which signal as their role as educating people about Israel, Zionism, blurred lines, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism in the UK, and so on. And I could go on. I mean, they're also affiliated to the World Zionist Organization, which has been reported on in Harriet's as being an organization that grabs land in the occupied territories and assists settlers. So, you know, the argument about what the UJS isn't that blurred, right? It's an organization that promotes as one of its, maybe the better way to put it would have been like this. One of the tasks and roles of the UJS as it understands itself and defines itself publicly is the advancement of relationships with Israel and the defense of Israel from criticism and attack on campus. It creates Israel engagement officers on every campus to try and, quote from their website, impact the debate on Israel. I don't think it's that far from that to say that it's acting in a particular way. It is pushing the campaign on the IHRA on campuses. It has a tally of universities on its website and it's kind of ticking them off. Which one's done it? Which one hasn't taken? So it clearly has a politicized agenda with regard to the IHRA. It's not innocent in that sense. I wouldn't go as far as, I wouldn't go as far as the words that maybe David used, but that was in a public meeting, and I don't think they amounted to anti-Semitism. That's the first. The last thing I'm going to say, sorry, and I spoke too long. I didn't mean to speak so long on that. There is a capitulation happening amongst student unions, including the Bristol one, I hear, because of the language, a certain language associated with a certain branch of what has become known as identity politics. I am in favor of identity politics when it means non-discrimination, right? But the language here is the language, as some people have mentioned, of being unsafe or feeling unsafe. But it's also the language which was used by our senior management at UCL to try and push the definition. It's the idea that an oppressed group has to be allowed to define its own oppression, give its own definition of its oppression. And we all know what a canard that is, because what that means is you ignore the elements of the oppressed group that disagree with you, and you listen to the part of the oppressed group that you want to listen to. You listen to power over those who do not have power within that group. So you listen to, for example, the CST or the BOD, but you don't listen to JVL or independent voices, independent Jewish voices in Canada. You don't even listen, by the way, to the Reform Movement USA, the largest denomination, Jewish denomination in the United States, who've come out and said they're against the IHRA being used as an enforceable legal instrument, even though they've adopted it, but they don't want it used legally against anybody. So, you pick the people you listen to and then you define them as the voice of the oppressed. And that's an age-old trick. It's an age-old trick that we should always expose.
Thank you very much, Saladin. Thank you. And Tom, do you want to provide some closing remarks and responses? Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
I just want to read one sentence from the Equality and Human Rights Commission document I quoted when I was talking. Amongst the key points for universities to consider, because that was a document targeted at universities, was everyone has the right to express and receive views and opinions, including those that may offend, shock, or disturb others. So, if you're offended, that's your problem, really. And I would stick to that. Okay, that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, and finally, Anita, you've already provided your closing comments, I think, haven't you?
I'd just like to suggest that we set up another time or to feed into some other issues. I just think there's something very good about being very specific about David, keeping an eye on him, and maybe having another meeting in maybe 2 weeks' time, get some more people involved, maybe even see if we can get into the press. I mean, this is a very, very interesting meeting. It would be,
Yeah, thank you, Anita. We've got the email addresses of people who signed up to the event, and we've already suggested that we circulate Tom's letter so that other people might model letters to the university based on Tom's letter, and people that have organised this meeting, the David Miller Defence team, we can think about further actions to come out of this meeting. So I'm really grateful for all of you that have come today, and especially for the speakers who've come at such very short notice. So thank you very much, everybody, and we will be in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you, Esther. Please.
Thanks, Esther.
Thank you.
Very much. Hello, Deepa. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina, for doing all that
Thank
techie
you, no
stuff.
problem.
Thank you.
Solidarity, comrades.
Thank you, solidarity.
Solidarity.